McGraw.
Refresh our memory. Where'd you go to high school?
I moved away from St. Louis when I was just a little kid, so I went to high school in Maryland, but I was born in Webster Grove.
Gotcha. You still have family here, though, don't you?
A lot of them, yeah. In fact, my son and daughter-in-law and granddaughters live in Webster now.
Okay, good. And you're going to be at Left Bank Books tomorrow to talk about this new book called Hugh 1968, which, talk about perfect timing, some renewed attention to the Vietnam War thanks to you and now Ken Burns.
Well, I think that Burns documentary definitely has done a great deal more than my book to pique people's interest in Vietnam. It's interesting, McGraw, there's a generational divide here. Those of us who are old enough remember that the city where the battle is that I wrote about is called Hue, 1968, whereas younger people like you call it Hugh.
Me, who are uninformed, call it Hugh, but it's Way 1968. But it's interesting because you're right. I only know Vietnam from I heard of the Tet Offensive. I knew Vietnam. I knew what the Viet Cong. I knew the names, but I didn't really understand what the fight was about. And for you and him to sort of revisit this gives us a whole new look and puts it into a perspective that you want to pull your hair out once you hear the full story about what actually happened in Way 1968.
I think that's true, and I do think that the passage of time has enabled me and filmmakers like Burns to look at Vietnam somewhat dispassionately. And really, for many years after the war, there was such political division in the country over interpretation of the event that you really couldn't talk about it without kind of aligning yourself with one side or the other. But I do think that enough time has gone by, even for people who are veterans of the war, to assess it a little bit more dispassionately and kind of arrive at a deeper understanding of what exactly happened and why.
It seems like Mark Bowden, who's going to be at Left Bank Books tomorrow for a book signing and a book reading about his new book, Way, H-U-E, 1968, that the Tet Offensive, in which one of the battles took place in this town, was before the Tet Offensive and after the Tet Offensive. Is that accurate?
I think that's fair to say. Prior to the Tet Offensive in early 1968, the Johnson administration and General William Westmoreland, who was the commander of all troops in Vietnam, had essentially promised the American people that this war was going to be won handily. And in fact, Westmoreland gave a speech in November of '67 predicting that American troops would begin to come home in the following year. Instead, this enormous offensive took place, which demonstrated the power of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and put a lie, I think, to the stories that the Johnson administration had been telling. So after Tet, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about how to win the war. It became a debate in the country over how best to leave Vietnam.
The Vietnam War, too big to tackle in one book. The Tet Offensive, too big. But you decided to focus on this one battle. Why?
Because I'm primarily a journalist, McGraw, and I'm a storyteller. I am not equipped or inclined to sit and write a 8-volume history of the war in Vietnam. I'm far more interested in a great story, and this battle, which was the largest and bloodiest fought in Vietnam, is that. I mean, it's just a very compelling and dramatic story. And I think if you dig deeply enough into a single event, such as this battle, or for instance, the Battle of Mogadishu, which I wrote about in Black Hawk Down, it gives you a broader perspective on the whole story.
Hugh was pretty bloody, wasn't it? It was the bloodiest of the Tet Offensive, was it not?
It was. It was the only major battle fought in Vietnam in a city. And, of course, that meant there were many tens of thousands of civilians trapped in the middle of it. There were also about 10,000 enemy troops that took the city and held it for a month. So it took roughly, I would say 5,000 to 10,000 American soldiers and Marines to, battle house to house and block to block in order to clear the enemy out of way. So the battle itself, which I think ended in easily more than 10,000 deaths on both sides, is, by far the most significant single conflict in the war.
Mark Bowden, how did you go about finding soldiers in Vietnam who fought for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong? How did you go about finding them, 50 years later?
I hired a fellow named Ho Dang Hoa, who, unbeknownst to me before I hired him, had been working with Ken Burns on his series. Hoa is a retired Vietnamese military officer, much too young to have fought in what they call the American War, but he had connections with the Vietnamese military, with the government, and was very useful in tracking down veterans of the Battle of Hue.
And what did you glean? What did you want to know? Because I can only imagine what those conversations were like.
Well, it was obviously fascinating, McGraw, because each of those stories, just as all the American stories, are different. You had veteran soldiers who had fought against the French and the Japanese, and who were then fighting against Americans, and who would go on to fight against the Chinese and the Cambodians. So for them, the American War was just a chapter in a much longer struggle. And then you had young villagers like Che Tin Mung, an 18-year-old girl whose older sister had been killed fighting with the Viet Cong, and whose grandfather and father had fought against the Viet Minh, the French, in the French War. So I think the one common theme with the Vietnamese was that this was a part of their life. It was a lifelong struggle, as opposed to Americans who went to Vietnam for a tour of 12 to 13 months.
Mark Bowden, our guest. The book is called Hue, H-U-E, 1968, and he'll be at Left Bank Books tomorrow night. What I find interesting, and again, learning about this for the first time, or looking at this differently, because this is now back in the news, or back as people are sort of looking at it again through the eyes of a 21st century. The Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they weren't necessarily communists. They didn't seem to care who they got backing from. They just wanted a free country to be able to decide for themselves how to govern themselves. They didn't much care for the communists more than they did the capitalists of America.
I think that's true. In fact, I think probably most of them would have had a hard time even defining such terms as communist and capitalist. And I think that's also true, frankly, of a lot of the young Americans who were fighting in Vietnam. The truth is that Ho Chi Minh had spent his life trying to win independence for Vietnam. Initially had gone to Paris in 1916 to try to meet with Woodrow Wilson to solicit American aid, had worked with American forces in the OSS to fight against the Japanese, and ultimately didn't get any help from the United States. The United States instead backed their own regime in South Vietnam, and so Ho turned to Moscow and Beijing, where he got the kind of support he needed to carry the fight forward. So, it certainly is true that the regime in Hanoi was a doctrinaire communist one, and I think the loss of that war by the United States, I think, left the Vietnamese people with a one-party state, which is kind of sad. But nevertheless, it at least is an authentically Vietnamese one. And most people I met there are overall content with the way that things worked out.
The Tet Offensive, by all accounts, was a disaster for the North Vietnamese. America and the South Vietnamese clearly were the victors, fought back the offensive, but they lost the battle, but won the PR game, right?
Well, I think you could say that. I mean, certainly the United States set itself up for the ultimate failure by over-promising. Essentially, General Westmoreland was saying that the enemy didn't have the capability of launching attacks anywhere other than in the mountains or in the far reaches of the country. And on the night of January 31st, they attacked every single city and town in South Vietnam and took Hue, which was the third largest city in that country and held it for a month. So you can call it a defeat, and in fact they were ultimately chased from the city of Hue, but it was such a demonstration of power and such a demonstration of capability that it shocked not just the American people, but the South Vietnamese people, and certainly shocked the American military command.
What kills me is we have the tapes. You went and looked at the research. We have tapes. We have the memos. They're in the Oval Office, and they're all saying, we don't want to get bogged down. We send more troops. They're just going to die. This is a bad idea. The American people doesn't want this. Nobody should do this. Okay, let's send 100,000 more troops.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. I mean, I think that a lot of the veterans who I interviewed, and I interviewed many, feel very betrayed. And, they feel betrayed by many things. Some feel betrayed by their military leaders. Some feel betrayed by politicians or the American people. But the truth is that the architects of the war, people like Robert McNamara, had concluded as early as 1966 that there was no way we could win that war. And nevertheless, they kept selling it to the American people. They kept, as you say, upping the numbers of American troops and sort of doubling down on what they knew to be a bad bet. And the reasons for that are interesting, complex, and ultimately tragic.
Mark Bowden, any movie offers on the book as of yet?
Yes, in fact, Michael Mann, the producer and director, is making a 10-part miniseries out of the book for the channel FX. And I met with him a couple weeks ago in Los Angeles. He's on his way to Vietnam. It looks like it's going to go forward. Beautiful.
Can he do also the Killing Pablo story too while we're at it?
Well, I think that there's a TV show on Netflix called Narcos, which pretty much ripped off my book, to be honest. But there's still a chance, I suppose, that the fellow who owns the rights to Killing Pablo will do something himself.
I always thought Entourage, that movie they were doing on Entourage, was sort of a takeoff on your Pablo Escobar book.
It definitely was, and because that project was famous in Hollywood for having gotten lost in one of these sort of studio cul-de-sacs. And everybody thought it would be a great idea for a movie, but nobody would step forward with the money to make it. I think largely because most of the characters in it are Hispanic. A lot of that concern has gone away, and that Hispanic audiences are now huge in this country for films, and Americans have shown that they'll go see movies like Sicario that have a primarily a Hispanic cast. But it kind of got lost in the weeds, and I think on Entourage they poke some fun at it.
There you go. Mark Bowden, you're always welcome here. Your new book is called Hue, 1968, H-U-E. Amazon bookstores, if you can find it. You're a great author and a great writer, and I'm sure you did this story justice. Tomorrow night, Left Bank Books, 7 o'clock for a book signing and a book reading. Mark, you're always welcome here. Thanks for checking in.